panel on religious identities, and one of the venues for exploring religious identities in South Asia concerns the issue of affirmative action. Today, India has the largest affirmative action state in the world, aimed at rectifying the backwardness of certain classes and communities of India that have been identified as scheduled castes. Today also, those who convert to Christianity from Dalit backgrounds are denied assistance from the state on account of their conversion. And my paper attempts to give a little bit of a background to how this policy came into being. To this day, the government refuses to recognize Dalit Christians as members of India's scheduled castes. Those who are counted as SCs, or scheduled castes, qualify for state assistance and quotas in education and employment under existing affirmative action schemes. The policy traces back to an order from 1950 called the Constitutional Order of 1950, which established state-specific lists of communities that could be classified as SCs. And that particular order stipulates that no person professing a religion different from Hinduism shall be deemed a member of a scheduled caste. And that order was amended twice. It was amended in 1956 to include Sikhs, and again in 1990 to include Neo-Buddhists. In spite of persistent appeals to make the reservation list completely religion blind, Dalit Christians and also Muslims find themselves excluded from SC status on the basis of their religious identity. Repeated protests of this policy across India have stressed the high degree of discrimination that persists in their lives as Christians. This advocacy appears to have landed on deaf ears even during the long reign of the Congress Party, which purports to support secularism and the rights of minorities in India. Much of the discussion of these affirmative action schemes in India has been centered on developments of the post-independence era. They tend to emphasize the issue of politics, the politics of numbers, the issue of Hindu nationalism, the surge of Hindu nationalism over the last couple of decades. My paper attempts to anchor the policy in developments of the colonial period. It was during the colonial period that some of the most important policies were formulated that cemented very sharp differences between religious communities, and I'm trying to make the case that the policy of excluding Dalit Christians from these SC lists is actually anchored in a type of knowledge production that was prevalent during the colonial period. That certain understandings about the plight of converts were solidified under colonialism, specifically the idea that a convert is someone who is severed or completely cut off from their family or cut off from Hindu society. And because of this state of exile, experiences certain kinds of civil disabilities. Under the Hindu law implemented by colonial courts, Christian converts and other apostates from Hinduism were considered polluted on account of having lost their caste status. And in that state of pollution, their families could evict them and deny them inheritance and other family rights. So I argue that this image of outcasting under Hindu law has been reenacted in the exclusion of Dalit Christians from these reservation lists. Having left the Hindu family, Dalit Christians are no longer eligible to receive benefits aimed at rectifying the historical abuses of Hinduism. By such logic, knowledge production in the 19th century informs the policies and politics of the post-independent era. My paper has several sections. I'm going to skip over some of the earlier sections that deal with the emergence of missionaries as patrons of the converts and the type of advocacy they engaged in order to address the civil disabilities of converts. But missionaries contributed to the accumulation of a very significant body of ethnography concerning India's caste system and the plight of so-called untouchables, untouchable communities And for a significant period of time, the ethnographic data that was compiled by missionaries was actually utilized by the government, the colonial government, in order to formulate its policies toward Christians. But gradually, this dialogical relationship between missionary knowledge and colonial knowledge evaporated. It broke down, and the colonial state began to make very objective claims about the condition of Christians in India. And one of the assumptions that became very dominant that was formulated by the colonial state, especially in court cases dealing with converts, is that when someone converts to Christianity, they enter a domain in which caste is irrelevant because the Christian religion does not teach caste. And so under colonialism, the native Christian community was identified as a community in which caste is not observed and it's not practiced. And missionary ethnography suggested the contrary, that even after conversion, there is this grappling with the realities of caste in the life of the church. There is a persistence of caste in the life of the church. But toward the latter part of the 19th century, the courts and the state itself adopted this idea that Christianity did not observe caste distinctions, and that's one of the factors that has fed the policies of the post-colonial era. So I have a section in the paper that deals with the disabilities of converts under Hindu law, and the big issue in the 19th century was whether conversion to Christianity leads to disability or whether it actually leads to advantage and upward mobility. And the simple answer to that question is that if you're a person from a high caste and you convert to Christianity, you suffer disabilities because of the exclusion from your family and the loss of status and the pollution that comes from losing caste status. But if you're a person from a low caste or a Dalit community and you convert to Christianity, the presumption was that you were elevating your caste status and that conversion was a means to upward mobility. And so these discourses competed with each other through the 19th century, and eventually the state seems to have gravitated toward this notion that conversion not only leads to the eradication of caste, but it also leads to the relative mobility of Dalits through the social system. From there, my paper moves into talking about this notion of the castelessness of Christianity. I trace the emergence of missionary ethnography from the 1830s and 1840s to the latter part of the 19th centuries. And I describe how in the beginning of the 19th century, missionaries were uniformly opposed to the caste system. They took a very strong stand against the caste system and insisted that caste was an impediment to the spread of the gospel and that it was antithetical to Christianity. And toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, because of the advent of group conversions, mass conversion movements, there was a more ironic tone struck on the part of missionaries toward caste, because large castes were converting to Christianity, and they retained some of their identity characteristics even in their lives as Christians, and some of the distinctions that they observed continued to be practiced within the domain of the church. But despite the fact that missionaries were becoming more reconciled to the reality of caste in the lives of Christians, the state still retained this position that Christianity, by definition, does not teach caste. And that was something that was really consolidated toward the end of the 19th century. So I want to turn now to recent challenges to the 1950 order that excludes Dalit Christians from scheduled caste status. There were two moments since the 1980s in which this order was challenged in court. And at the state level. In both of these instances, state authorities seem to revise the working assumptions that Christians do not observe caste distinctions or that the church was by definition a casteless domain. The first of these instances was in 1985 when a Tamil Christian cobbler from the low-ranking Adi Dravida community sued the village industry board in Chennai for religion-based discrimination. The board denied him welfare assistance because he was a Christian. This particular man, Susai, contended that he is a member of the Adi Dravida community, which was listed in the original SC lists in 1950 and had remained a member of that community even after he became a Christian. He argued that the 1950 order was invalid because it penalizes his change of religion, contrary to Articles 14 and 15 of the Indian Constitution, which ensured equal protection under the law and freedom of religion, respectively. Conversion, he argued, in no way eliminated the deprivations faced by members of his community. In the court's decision, the judges did not deny the continuity of caste identity after conversion, but contended that the plaintiff, Susai, needed to show more than the fact that he simply belonged to a caste. He needed to show that because of his caste, he faced a comparable depth of social and economic disabilities and cultural backwardness and similar levels of degradation within the Christian community, necessitating intervention by the state. So it's not enough to prove that you're a member of a caste, you have to prove that you face the same degree of social discrimination and adversity on account of your identity, on account of your caste identity. This decision of the court was actually a step in the direction that Dalit Christians have been advocating, because it at least conceded that there is this persistence of caste identity in the lives of Dalit Christians. And the court's acknowledgement of this is a marked change from earlier decisions tracing back to the early 19th century, which simply regarded Christianity as a casteless domain, and concluded from this that Christians possess no caste identity. The need for an authoritative and detailed study, and that was another part of the decision. There's no authoritative and detailed study that documents the persistence of caste practices among Christians. Would arrive, but that detailed study would arrive some 20 years later in a report published by the Mishra Commission. This is a commission headed by former Chief Justice Ranganath Mishra in 2005. And that took the debate one step further. Unlike the court case, the Mishra Commission not only recognized caste as a pervasive institution in Indian society, but clearly acknowledged the persistence of ritual discrimination faced by Christian converts. I'll quote from the report. The position of persons of SC origin converted to Christianity remains the same as before. They continue to be forced into the most demeaning occupations. Their position both in the church as well as amongst fellow Christians is no better than that suffered by their counterparts in other religions. They continue to be both poor and socially and educationally backward. Intermarriages between them and upper caste Christians are rare. In the churches, they are segregated from the upper caste Christians. Even after death, they're buried in separate burial grounds. So the Mishra report took it a step further and acknowledged that there is severe disadvantage faced by Dalit Christians. And so it was left to the government to decide, based on the report, are they going to alter the 1950 order? And this was the government of the United Progressive Alliance. A significant contingent was the Congress Party. And even then, in spite of the publication of this report, the Congress Party refused to change the order. So there is a certain durability to this order, despite the evidence that points to the contrary. And I contend in this paper that that durability of the policy is because it has this deep history behind it, and that Dalit Christians have to contend with the missionary discourses that were produced earlier on that argue A, that Christianity is a casteless domain, and B, that it explains the comparable mobility of people once they become Christian. And if you are, in fact, more socially mobile once you become a Christian, by that logic, you are less in need of affirmative action assistance from the government. So the story of Christian conversion in India began with an eviction, an act of severance, and this particular knowledge system has been imputed onto a very large class of people, the Dalit Christians, even though it was intended to, these policies were formulated in relation to people who once lost their caste status, and were people of high caste status and lost that status. And the larger aims of the paper is to explore this relationship between textual knowledge and ethnography and state policies, which were consolidated in the colonial period and continue to exert their influence in the post-colonial period.